You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the ideas in a very interesting book called Punished by Rewards: The Trouble with Gold Stars, Incentive Plans, A's, Praise, and Other Bribes by Alfie Kohn. This is a very interesting book. I also found it quite a frustrating book because some of the ideas in it are great and some of them I have some criticisms of, but it's certainly very thought-provoking and it's relevant for many of the topics that we talk about on The Voluntary Life, including parenting and entrepreneurship, because it's all about the idea of reward and punishment and incentive schemes, both in terms of parenting and in schools and in business. So this week I'm going to be talking about the ideas relating to parenting and schooling, and then next week I'll tackle those parts of the book that deal with the idea of incentives in business. Before we get to that though, I would like to say a big thank you to my new patron on Patreon, Daniel N. Don't forget that you can get bonus episodes of The Voluntary Life every week and many other rewards by becoming a supporter of the show on Patreon. And to find out more about that, click the link in the show notes, which you can find directly in your podcast app, or you can go to my website, thevoluntarylife.com, or directly to my Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So here's a summary of the book Punished by Rewards from the Amazon page for the book. Our basic strategy for raising children, teaching students, and managing workers can be summed up in 6 words. Do this and you'll get that. We dangle goodies, from candy bars to sales commissions, in front of people in the same way that we train the family pet. Unfortunately, attempts to manipulate people with incentives ultimately fail and even do lasting harm. Drawing from hundreds of studies, Kohn demonstrates that people actually do inferior work when they are enticed with money, grades, or other rewards. What's more, they tend to lose interest in whatever they have been manipulated with rewards to do. Over the years, this groundbreaking book has persuaded countless parents, teachers, and managers that rewards and punishments are actually 2 sides of the same coin, and it's a coin that doesn't buy very much. Kohn explains what it means to work with people instead of doing things to them, at home, in school, and at work. So that's a summary of what this book is about, and I have had this book recommended to me many times in the past. It's one that I've been meaning to read for a long time. I certainly think the subject is very important and very interesting, both for parenting in terms of, how to behave towards your kids and what kind of issues come up if you use punishment and reward type approaches to parenting. But also, I think it's a really interesting question in business. How do you incentivize people and what are the problems with incentive schemes? And what should we think about them and what's the right way to incentivize people at work? So this is a book that's well known in parenting circles, especially peaceful parenting circles. It's been very influential on that whole approach to parenting. And it's also quite well known as a wider book about work and schooling and so forth. I was also interested to read it because I am very interested in critiques of schooling. I've spoken about my own experience and my idea that a lot of schooling really just teaches employee conditioning and how that is not a good start, especially if you want to become an entrepreneur. And I wrote about that in my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur. So I've been meaning to read this book for a long time. My experience with the book was that I did find it a frustrating read. It's certainly been a very thought-provoking book for me. I've written a lot of notes on it, and I appreciate that it is clearly written. It's written by an academic. Alfie Kohn's an academic, but it's not an academic book. It's not jargony, and it's not long-winded. The language is very straightforward, and I certainly appreciate that. But I found it frustrating because there are some ideas in here that I think are great, some really good stuff, and I think there's some kind of silly stuff in there too. In short, I really like a lot of his comments on parenting. I think some of his ideas about schooling are not really very radical at all, even though he seems to think that he's incredibly radical. And I found that he seems to be quite ignorant about many aspects of incentive schemes in business. He just doesn't seem to understand business very well. I don't think he's got much experience in business. So I do think that although there are massive problems with incentive schemes, his critique has a lot of problems with it. But I'm going to tackle the business side of this book in a separate episode because it's kind of a separate topic, although Alfie Kohn certainly thinks that he has this theory that applies to both parenting and schooling and business, and the same problem he sees in all these three areas, sort of in terms of his theory. So in this episode, I'll talk about his ideas as they relate to parenting and schooling. Alfie Kohn himself is a former teacher, and he talks in the book a little bit. He doesn't speak very personally in the book, but he talks a little bit about his own background experience that led him to some of these ideas. He was a teacher, teaching in school, and he became disillusioned with his experience trying to do, if you like, traditional teaching, the kind of reward and punishment style of teaching. I doubt very much that he did very much of the punishment. He's kind of a hippie in terms of his general approach, but I think he became very disillusioned with giving grades to kids and also with trying to engage kids in school and not finding it working within the confines of the traditional way of grading kids and rewarding kids for their obedience and performance in school. He then became an academic and started writing books, and I think he's been associated with various universities, and that's what he is now. He's kind of a public intellectual, writes books, does speaking engagements about these ideas. Although he doesn't say so in his books explicitly, it's certainly clear that he is kind of a new left socialist, I would say, in his overall outlook. A lot of his criticism of the business side of incentive schemes very much comes from a general criticism of the marketplace. And I'll talk more about that in the next episode. But he's a little bit shy about being explicit about his political perspectives, but it comes through quite strongly in this book. And where it really came through is in another book of his that I picked up, which is called Against Competition, which is essentially just a socialist book. So that's kind of where he's coming from. He's a sort of new left type of socialist, not the kind of really old school authoritarian types, but more of the Bernie Sanders style of being a socialist. So this book is a critique and really an attack on the whole idea of incentive schemes, and he applies that idea to three different areas: to parenting, to school, and to work. As I said, in this episode, we're just talking about his ideas about parenting and school. But his approach is to identify the underlying social science theory or philosophy underneath this approach of providing reward and punishments. And he is criticizing this approach that's called behaviorism. Behaviorism is an approach to social science and psychology that tries to directly apply the method of the physical sciences to human beings and to study human beings as predictable, deterministic organisms. The idea being that you should be able to treat humans just exactly the same way that you would treat physical matter, and you should be able to find laws of behavior and regularities that you can predict people's actions. It's a very popular underlying assumption in social science generally and in the world as a whole. This is something that a lot of people don't realize, just how significant the idea of behaviorism is, because it sort of seems to stand to reason. I mean, if we understand the scientific method and we believe in the scientific method and we see all the great things that it's helped us achieve, why wouldn't you apply that to everything, including human beings? Because, of course, we do live in a causal universe, and so we ought to be able to predict the cause and effect of human behavior in the same way that we can predict physical matter and the changes in the physical universe. And there are all sorts of philosophical problems with this approach, not least of which is that if you want to try and treat human beings like that, you have to ignore their capability of reason. You have to ignore that people can actually change their minds and decide things for themselves. And it opens up this whole can of worms of how do we understand human beings and their ability to have free will and to be able to make decisions and learn and change their minds about things. How can we incorporate that into social science? Many people have much more intelligent and careful ways of trying to create a social science that doesn't pretend that humans can't make decisions, but actually tries to take that into account. And the behaviorist approach is really a very crude way. The behaviorist approach is essentially just to say, look, people are like stimulus and response machines. You push them in some ways and they will respond in other ways. And we just need to find out what the causes are of behaviors. And that's all that there is. Whatever goes on inside someone's head is kind of irrelevant. It's only their behavior that matters. This is what Alfie Kohn is actually trying to highlight as being the underlying idea. And if you apply that to parenting, the idea is you need to find ways to get kids to behave in the right way by giving them the right stimulus. So if you want them to do certain things, then you offer them rewards or you threaten them with punishments. And that's kind of the underlying philosophy behind this approach to parenting that he's criticizing, according to Alfie Kohn. Now, I do think that there is a huge problem with behaviorism, and it's an aspect of the social sciences that is really messed up. And a lot of people have criticized it with the word scientism. And I've done an episode about that called Imaginary Creatures and Machines as part of the Rational Thinking series. I'll put a link in the show notes as to what the problem with that is. I personally think that Alfie Kohn may be attributing a lot more philosophy underlying some of this kind of parenting and school than is actually at play. And I think he sees behaviorism in some places where that might not be what's really driving things. But nonetheless, I agree that there are huge problems with this approach. And I agree that it is a kind of social engineering idea that we can control people and control their behavior by prodding them with the right punishments and rewards. And he gives some interesting quotes from prominent behaviorists to show how kind of controlling this idea is. One is from John B. Watson, the behaviorist, who writes, "The interest of the behaviorist in man's doings is more than the interest of the spectator. He wants to control man's reactions as physical scientists want to control and manipulate other natural phenomena." So there you go, a very explicit description of this idea of social control. Of course, the behaviorists never explain how they, as human beings, somehow stand outside this, and they, as controllers, are somehow not subject to the same rules. Somehow it's always the other people who are the ones being experimented on, not the social scientists who call themselves behaviorists. Anyway, that's the kind of philosophical background. So Alfie Kohn then looks at reward and punishment approaches to parenting, and he talks about how damaging this approach can be and what's wrong with this approach. And I'll just read you a couple of quotes. He says, "What rewards and punishments do produce is temporary compliance. They buy us obedience. If that's what we mean when we say they work, then yes, they work wonders." So this is his idea, is that when you reward and punish children, you may get compliance, but what you're not getting is a genuine relationship with a child that is respectful of that child's autonomy as a person. And also, you're not getting a relationship where the child is internalizing the kind of values that you're trying to talk to them about. You're just getting them complying because there's a punishment or a reward. And he talks about why parents do this. And he says, "So why do we rely on extrinsic motivators with our children? For starters, we tend to fall back on whatever will produce compliance. It is more convenient for us to get the garbage taken out, to get a child into bed at night, or out of the door in the morning, to head off an imminent tantrum or squabble between siblings in the grocery store, regardless of how our tactics for doing this may affect the child's long-term development. Time constraints are very real, of course, and our own emotional needs, or even convenience, also count for something. But we need to be aware of the costs of these quick fixes. Rather than rationalizing them as being in the child's best interests, we ought to face the fact that behavioral manipulation is ultimately detrimental. Let us be honest when we reward or punish by asking ourselves for whom we are doing it, them or us. And for what? The development of good values or mere obedience?" So his argument is basically that when you use reward and punishment approaches to parenting with kids, you're really doing it for your own convenience and to get compliance. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that this is somehow in the best interest of the child, because it's basically manipulative and it's designed to get compliance rather than to help the child get better values, understand things, and so forth. He's not just criticizing harsh punishments like spanking, although he certainly does have a critique of spanking in the book, and he's not just criticizing a very obviously manipulative, if you do this good thing, then I'll give you that, rewards, he's also just talking about praise, how praise can be damaging. And the idea that is that praise can actually psychologically change the way that kids think about themselves, because it signals that they have low ability. It makes them feel more pressured. It invites them to take low-risk strategies to avoid failure and get more praise. And it reduces their interest in the task itself. And I thought that was all very interesting, this critique of punishment reward approaches to parenting and school and to work as well, which I'll come on to in the next episode. So here's the key point that Alfie Kohn is making about the idea of rewards and what is wrong with rewards. His key point is that external rewards damage your intrinsic motivation. That's the problem, is that these external things actually undermine the intrinsic motivation of a person who's being confronted with these rewards. And why is that? So interestingly, he suggests that there's two theories as to why external or extrinsic rewards undermine intrinsic rewards. I'll call these two theories the control theory and the rewards are always bad theory. So I think the control theory is much better. And by the way, Alfie Kohn is going to argue for the other theory. But just to explain these two theories. So the control theory is the idea that the problem with rewards is that they feel, or they can feel, like an attempt to control you. That's the problem. And he provides a couple of very interesting quotes from social scientists who argue for this point of view. So one of them says, some evidence even suggests that the extent to which we experience an environment as controlling is a better predictor of reduced interest than whether we have been offered a reward. So the argument is it's not the reward that's the problem, it's the implied manipulation or control that's underlying that is demotivating. And here's another quote. Reduced intrinsic motivation is the result of the imposition of superfluous extrinsic constraints, not a specific function of the use of tangible rewards per se. So that's the control theory. That idea is that what's going on here is that kids feel manipulated and controlled, and they feel like there's a power thing going on here, a control thing going on. And that's the same in other circumstances where punishment and reward and praise and this kind of thing doesn't work. However, Alfie Kohn is going to argue a different argument. He argues that rewards are essentially always bad. They're inherently bad. And his argument is, as he says, do this and you'll get that automatically devalues the this. That is, the task comes to be perceived as a tedious prerequisite for getting a goodie. So his idea is that the very act of offering a conditional reward for something devalues whatever it is that you have to do to get the reward. And this is why he thinks that he can apply this theory to everything, to parenting, to school, and to business. And as I will talk about in the business episode, I think he's wrong about that. I think he's missing the point, which is a control point. It's the power issue and the issue of control and the feeling manipulated that I think is the problem, not the fact that you might get a reward that is the problem. And one of the reasons that I think he doesn't go for this control explanation is that he doesn't seem to have a very clear theory of parenting and of the responsibilities of a parent and a child. Because for me, what's most important about the relationship between a parent and a child is that there is this enormous power imbalance there. And so you're not dealing with two consenting adults who can, make deals, negotiate with each other and so forth. There's a massive power imbalance. So any kind of conditional reward type situation, any kind of punishment or reward that's based on what the kid does is a totally unequal relationship. And so it's no wonder that it feels controlling for kids to be treated like that. I think Alfie Kohn gets that, but he doesn't really go into it in a lot of detail. And he's certainly, I think, partly because he's a socialist and partly because he has a critique of the market overall, he just hates the idea of people negotiating with each other with conditions. He hates the idea that you might be able to have a perfectly legitimate relationship where you say, if you do this, I'll give you that, or if I do this, you'll give me that, in the workplace, for example. So he wants his critique to be more about the idea of rewards rather than the idea of control, which I think is underlying this. And he kind of brushes over the control theory pretty quickly in his book. I'll talk more about that when I talk about his ideas for business, because I think it's in that aspect that it particularly comes out. So what is his approach to parenting and school that is different from this punishment and rewards type approach? Well, I've already mentioned a few things about his approach to parenting. He's very against spanking, and he's against the idea of offering this kind of treating your child like a pet approach where you will give them treats for good behavior and so forth. And I can really agree with a lot of what he says about that, because I do think, although we understand it in slightly different ways, I think he's right that when there's a massive power imbalance, it can be kind of creepy and manipulative to use carrots to try and get certain behaviors out of your kids. And I certainly found it quite thought-provoking that he applies this not just to punishments and direct conditional rewards, but also to things like praise. And so he argues against the kind of approach where you say, good job to your kids. And that certainly, when I see that happening, I can see how that is often very condescending towards kids and does kind of treat them a bit like pets. Apparently, his alternative approach with his daughter is just to say, you did it. I personally don't think that it's always bad to congratulate someone on having done something, including your kids. And I think it's more a question of what the context is and whether it has this kind of controlling feel to it or this patronizing feel to it. But I do get where he's coming from, and I think he's got a point about that. I found it interesting that some of his conclusions and recommendations, particularly about school, when it comes to kids, are not very radical at all. His proposals for kids in school are things like just try and avoid using grades wherever you can, and have cooperative learning in groups. And I mean, these are very 1960s style teaching approaches. And I've seen some of these things in my own childhood. I was born in the 70s and I saw some of this kind of approach in some of my teachers. And he also has the approach that he thinks kids in schools should be able to vote on things that happen in schools. For me personally, I found school boring enough without having long meetings and committees and resolutions and voting and bureaucracy inflicted on me. And I think some of the alternative schools, which have adopted different approaches to schooling, they have a lot of this voting approach, which always looks like it's much more fun and interesting for the adults. And I think it's much more ideological than the adults really realize. So I'm not massively keen on his ideas for school, and I don't think they're actually that radical. If you want to hear a radical approach, then have a look at the book Instead of Education by John Holt. And I've done a review of that book in 2 episodes previously on The Voluntary Life. I'll put a link in the show notes. That book is absolutely fascinating because that book really talks about this issue of control. John Holt in that book talks about how the problem with school is that the key thing it teaches kids is that you have to be here, whether you like it or not. And that is the biggest lesson in school that you get, that it is essentially a night release prison school. And that, in many ways, is more important than any of the other lessons. As soon as it becomes non-consensual, as soon as it becomes compulsory, then school is a very, very different thing than a place of free learning and letting children grow without manipulation in the way that I'm sure Alfie Kohn would like to see. So it's kind of interesting to me that Alfie Kohn didn't even address the ideas of John Holt in this book. He didn't talk about unschooling. He absolutely made no mention of it. And maybe that's because Alfie Kohn is a teacher and is kind of in that mentality and just hasn't even thought through an approach that would be so radically different, like to question compulsory schooling and to question whether that is the same thing as education. I mean, that's John Holt's big argument, is that don't confuse compulsory schooling with education. Education is good. Compulsory schooling is something very different. It's all about control. I think Alfie Kohn is confused in his idea of control, coercion, voluntary relationships, and what the boundaries between those things are. So those are some of the ideas that I wanted to share with you about Alfie Kohn's book, Punished by Rewards, when it comes to parenting and schooling. But I have a lot more to say about this, in particular with regard to workplace incentivization, because I think that's a fascinating topic, and it's another aspect of this book, and I'll deal with that in the next episode. I will just say also that if you're interested in these issues raised by this book, there are some other books that I think are particularly good. I personally think that Parent Effectiveness Training by Thomas Gordon is better as a book talking about alternative ways to parent that don't have this controlling, manipulative aspect. So I think Alfie Kohn does attempt to provide some alternatives in this book, but I think PET, Parent Effectiveness Training, does it better. Also, I've already mentioned Instead of Education, which I think is a much more radical alternative to schooling and a very challenging and fascinating read. And I will have some other recommendations about business books that tackle some of the topics covered by incentive schemes and their problems and why they're so difficult to implement and why they often fail. And I'll talk about that in the next episode. So I hope you found that interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.